The challenge here is, what is the North Star? What are we all aiming towards? And if we can't envision that, then how do we get there? How do we align ourselves so that we get to that next step?
Erum, congratulations.
Oh, thank you. It's been quite the past couple years, and congratulations to you. What are we congratulating on each other again?
This is our 100th episode, so...
Oh, snap. Wow.
I know we talked about it in our last episode, so it's a 2-episode celebration, but I think reaching this milestone is a big one. I mean, I know other people have hundreds. Some people even have thousands of podcast episodes, but 100 episodes, I think, is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. We wanted to save this 100th episode for a special guest who will, of course, do a wonderful introduction to, because he's a good friend of ours. But we're here. We're here. We're on the other side of it. We're in it. This is the 100th episode. It's a start of a new era, I would say. New era of grow everything.
Yeah, and we've been pretty busy. People know that we do this and we've got a day job. We run Messaging Lab, but we've also had some recent events that we've been deep in. Why don't we talk about those a little bit? Let's talk about the biosecurity event first.
Yeah, the biosecurity event was spearheaded by Andrew Hessel, co-author of The Genesis Machine, co-founder of GP Wright, Kevin Feingold's of Aclid, and you, Karl Schmieder of Messaging Lab.
I know, because, yeah, I mean, I'm going to joke around a little bit about it because I'm such a biosecurity expert, but which I'm not, by the way, but I do pay attention to it. And I had a whole thing I wanted to do on national security associated with natural resources, which at some point we'll talk about, or maybe I'll do a video and I'll post it. But it brought together a really interesting group of people, and we spent the whole day talking about biosecurity issues. It was an unconference, so it was unstructured. We talked about issues around what even is biosecurity, what's the definition of it. We tried not to be too anthropomorphizing when it came to it.
Anthropogenic.
Yeah, anthropogenic. Yeah, no, we tried to keep the definition broad so that we were not just focused on humanity, but also just all life, taking all life into consideration when it comes to biosecurity. And the reason why Andrew Hessel and Kevin put this together with my help was that DNA synthesis is something that's becoming very accessible. And there have been a number of incidents where people have been able to order DNA for things that are not good. I don't want to get into too many details. You can go out there and search for that. It's something that Kevin is on the front lines of working on, and I think we should get Kevin on here. But I think at the end of the day, we had a really good discussion. What do you think, Erum? You were there.
It was incredible because we had so many different perspectives. And as more tools become democratized or accessible when it comes to building with biology, these things need to be taken into consideration. Similarly, when the internet has become more pervasive and there's social media tools, but there was no regulation that was really built alongside of it in real time. Right now, we're just looking back and trying to scramble to create better regulations on using the internet or having different social tools and how that interacts with humans and human psychology, or even to the extent of e-commerce and influence. But now we can learn from that and build while we're flying the plane of building the bioeconomy, I guess. And what I took away from the people that were in the room, and a lot of people that are around this topic that we know, they want to be able to have a voice and make those types of regulations. They know it's important. They know what the risks are. So they're trying to get ahead of it. And a lot of it has to do with education. So you talked about, what does biosecurity mean? And there's a huge swath of the population that thinks that's viruses and pathogens that infect humans, and how to get ahead of that, when there is a broader definition that we need to take into consideration, particularly in the face of climate change. Yeah. What does that mean to protect our forests? What does that mean to protect living things across different scales, whether it's huge elephants and rhinoceri, I guess, and then small microbes? How do we protect microbes that have been evolving for billions of years, and then in an instant, they're gone because of anthropogenic activities?
Yeah, I just want to add one subtle point about the internet. Actually, 2 points. One is that I think Andrew or someone in the meeting pointed out that people were talking about cybersecurity long before the internet existed. So I thought that was super interesting. I have a draft of a piece that talks about that. But I think with biology, it's very challenging because, as you said, we're building the plane as we fly it, and we don't understand biology, just like we don't understand AI. AI continues to evolve so quickly. I think it makes it very challenging because we are biology, and biology can be both beneficial and detrimental to humans. It can be beneficial to the planet. It can also be detrimental to the planet. So I think that makes the idea of biosecurity that much more challenging. But I think it's really important for us to have those discussions. And you said education is a big part of it, and it's absolutely true. That was something that we hit upon. You mentioned the natural environment, which is something that I really wanted to talk about there. And like I said, I'm going to talk about it some more. But I did want to just mention that in terms of protecting the natural environment, there was some news. The Chumash Nation, if you want to call them that, they're one of the coastal California indigenous tribes. They just were able to create, with the state of California and the United States government, the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, which is the first tribally nominated sanctuary in the United States. So it's this huge 11,000 square kilometer portion of the California coastline that will not be able to be fished in. You're not going to be able to put wind turbines. It's this designation that will protect this part of the ocean. And there are people out there who say that we should really be protecting 1/3 of the global ocean to help it come back, because the problem is that we're probably going to overfish it. So that's also like related to biosecurity. But I was excited because the Chumash people were the Indian tribes of Ventura, California, which is where I grew up. And one of my favorite kids' book is about a Chumash woman who is abandoned on one of the islands. It's called The Island of the Blue Dolphins. It was like a early 60s book that many kids have read. It's actually based on a true story of this lone Chumash woman who spent probably 20 or 30 years by herself on one of these islands and just had to survive. It's a beautiful kid's story. It's kind of scary, but kids do get into these stories about, I ran away from home and I lived in the woods, or I was on a plane crash and I had to live in the Alaskan tundra by myself. So anyway, there was another event that I wasn't a part of. I'd like to hear about that.
So we've been busy co-hosting events now, not just attending them, but we've been participating in them, bringing people into the room. So you did the biosecurity event. I did the US-India Next Gen Materials event, which was bringing together founders that are based in India and also the United States that are making materials, all sorts of materials, whether they're packaging or coatings or ingredients or chemicals. And really, we brought everyone together to share knowledge, share resources, talk about certain challenges when it comes to scaling a company. What does that mean when you're trying to produce a material? How much capital do you need to raise? How do you engage with big corporations? What does that look like? How do you navigate them? And it was incredible because we had people that are in different parts of the world that look at business a little bit differently. They might have different resources that want to understand how business operates in both countries. And it was great. So how this happened is that there's an amazing woman that I know named Mridu Changani, and she has an organization called Terrarium that looks at next-gen materials in India. We also brought in two other amazing people, Aaron Nesser, who's a co-founder of Keel Labs and who has been working with a lot of startups in the material space to help them prototype and raise money. And it's incredible how he can really slice and dice the material space and what founders need, or he does a good job of listening and synthesizing information. And then another friend of ours, Ella King, who has been working at really big companies, big brands on the packaging side. So she worked at L'Oreal for some time. She works at Avery Dennison, but also very passionate about the material startup community. And anytime I talk to her, I learn a wealth of information about how companies operate, how they're thinking about sustainability, and just how things are defined. So materials being eco-friendly, that doesn't necessarily equate biodegradability. And what does composting mean? Is there commercial composting? Is it composting that's going into infrastructure, or can it go into landfills? So really getting down to the brass tacks of what it means to make sustainable materials. It was amazing. It was just great to have those conversations. We created this space for founders on both sides of the world to come together. And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I remember that either with the conversation we had with Jackie Amable of Material or Julia Marsh of Sway, we did dig into what does biodegradability really mean. And I can't remember if it was Australian or Austrian regulations. Sorry, I do know there is a big difference between Austria and Australia. I just don't remember which one has the world standard when it comes to biodegradability. But it sounds like an incredible event. I'm sorry I missed it. We need to get both Erin and Elle King on here. They do always blow my mind whenever we talk to them. So before we get into our guests, we had a couple of news items. I mentioned the Chumash Nation. I had a couple of other things. Do you want to tell me, you had something about embryos being scanned for IQ? What's up with that?
That's it. That's what's up. I mean, wow. I mean, we live in a world where we can analyze DNA at the very, 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 very early stages of life. In the world of IVF, you have embryos that are sitting there waiting to be incubated or implanted. But sometimes you have a certain amount and you have to choose which embryo to be implanted. There's been a few companies that have been on my radar that look for specific diseases. They scan for male or female, things that are like this isn't news, but there's one company that has been charging to scan for intelligence and IQ. It's so controversial. What does intelligence mean? That needs to be defined, but it looks like they're looking at specific genes that have been associated with what the IQ quotient is. And they're marketing those services for scanning. I think the company is called Heliospec Genomics, and I think they're charging about 50 grand to be able to test embryos. It's just interesting. I know this is the world of biotech when it comes to healthcare and humans. Everything is about shifting away from petrochemicals, but yes, we're also growing ourselves as humans. And when we can select specific humans, what does that mean for our society? It dovetails into so many controversial topics when we think of eugenics, when we think of designer babies. But there's these stories that people are doing things, they're making decisions. They have access to technology, they have access to capital, and how they apply it is interesting. Should they be doing it? And obviously, there's good intentions, but what's a life cycle analysis of a company doing something like that where they're selecting for intelligence? What does that mean? And again, it's a story that broke. I haven't dug into it. If anyone listening has looked into it or has any thoughts, please share them, because we are at a time where we can make decisions and do things that will completely change the way that humans are come into the world. It's insane.
Yeah, so that story didn't really surprise me that much. The price also doesn't surprise me because it's early adopters. What I do know in following prenatal screening is that they are very good at choosing for eye color and height. I don't know, or I haven't heard that intelligence is one of those traits that you can accurately choose for. So I'd like to dig into that more, and I'd like to hear what people in the audience think about it. But yeah, it's super interesting. It moves us into the world of Gattaca. It's one of those things that we definitely don't talk enough about, but we should talk about more. The other kind of news items that I had that I'd put on there were the Nobel Prize was given out last week. I don't think we talked about it at all. And the prize was given for computational protein design and AI. One of the people who is very important in protein design is University of Washington professor David Baker. And I don't know if you've been on any phone calls with him or any webinars. I've been on a couple. I was one in particular that was held where he and George Church were talking, and they actually talked a little bit about biosecurity. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And David Baker, clearly a very bright guy and very interesting person. So congratulations to the people who won that Nobel Prize.
I'm so excited. It's great that he is recognized for his work. I think for us, we are living in a world where his science and technology or his approach is being used all over the place, right? So we have clients that are doing computational drug design or protein design. So there is a whole world already built on top of David Baker's work, right? David Baker did this in 2003. So now this is 20 years later. It's just great to see that now there are all these other companies spinning up and being able to bring his science that he did and the work that he did to life. And he should be very proud of that. He should be very proud of the companies that now exist and the impact that they have because of computational protein design.
Absolutely. So why don't we talk about the guests that we've got for our 100th episode?
Yes. Well, we have been waiting for a while for our guest to come on the pod. We've been asking him to come on because we love him, but he's been super busy moving and shaking, as you'll find out that he has done a lot. And our guest today is Dan Grushkin of Genspace, of Biodesign Challenge, of TomTex, so many other things that he'll talk about in this episode. And what a delightful person. Why don't you quickly share your story of how you met Dan?
To be honest, I don't remember how I met
Yeah,
Dan,
that's a
but
long
I feel
time
like I've known him for a really long time.
Yeah.
I'm sure that it has to do with Genspace, and that's like how we connected. You and I talk about connecting at Genspace. So I think that's a big part of the origin story of how we've known Dan. And we've gotten to watch him grow as he's grown the Biodesign Challenge. And then as that became its own entity, he in turn has moved to TomTex, where he's Chief Strategy Officer. And we're going to be super interested to see how that evolves.
Yeah. So without further ado, here's our interview with Dan Grushkin, our guest for our 100th episode.
All right. Dan Grushkin, welcome to the Grow Everything podcast. We're so happy to have you here because, number one, Erum and I would have never met if it weren't for you and your previous efforts. Number two, you're an all-around great guy that we love. You've been a big part of our community. And by the way, we tried for a really long time to get you on the podcast in like the first 10 episodes or 20, but here we are. We're overjoyed to have you on the 100th episode. Congratulations and welcome to Grow Everything, Dan Grushkin.
Woo-hoo. So glad to be here. 100. Congratulations. I am honored to be your 100th guest. I'm glad I held out.
Dan, let's kick it off. You've done journalism, you've done nonprofits, you started Genspace, which was where Erum and I met. But how did you get into biology? And what was the moment where you decided, I need to do this thing called Genspace? What was the genesis story of that?
We are going back to 2008, 2009.
Woo.
Exactly. Or even earlier. I'm going to start in college. So in college, I was an English major, but I was a bit masochistic and taking physics classes on the side. I didn't realize it, but I was looking for two types of truth: the more scientific, basic, mathematical truth, and the more, I don't know, feely truth that is reading literature and thinking about the state of the world. And I didn't really know how to marry those two for a good solid couple of years. I started my career as a journalist in the Middle East. I was covering the collapse of the peace process, which was devastating just to be there. When I finally came back to the United States, I was looking for news that was positive. And I dug around for a little while. I was writing about travel journalism because I'd been living abroad and it didn't really suit me. And then I was writing for a magazine called National Geographic Adventure, and they asked me to write about malaria. And malaria, the subject, the parasite, changed everything for me. I started to research the plasmodium and just how strange its life cycle is and how it travels from the liver to the bloodstream to the mosquito salivary gland down to its gut. And it just lived this very, what I call Baroque life, moving in an impossible, possibly different locations around people in the world. And I thought, wow, this is the most deadly creature on Earth, this bug. I realized just on a microbial level, on the micro scale, the world is so rich and so complex and just so exciting. It got me started into writing about science. From there, it was synthetic biology. And from there, I was staying up all night watching iGEM videos in the early days of iGEM. And I could not get enough. And the thought of somehow being able to work with, manipulate, engineer microorganisms, I mean, literally kept me up all night with excitement. So I started writing about it as a journalist. And again, my quote unquote PhD was interviewing these top scientists and asking lots of dumb questions and occasionally smart ones. And eventually I got to the point where I could ask them questions that would stump them. And then I knew the article was ready. But spending time with them, spending time in their labs, I just wanted to try it. For someone who was early mid-career in journalism, the idea of going back and getting a PhD just to do some basic transformations with bacteria it didn't make sense. It also didn't seem like a real option. Really, was I going to spend 7 years to try my hand at something that iGEMers were doing literally in freshman year of college? The answer was no, but there was no venue for me. And so at that time, DIY Bio was a message board going strong. There were a group of people saying, hey, why can't regular people who are non-scientists, jump into the science game, get to work with synthetic biology? At the same time, the science community and synthetic biology was saying, hey, we want science to be open to a wider audience. We want to make engineering biology easier. So I was watching the iGEM videos, and the synthetic biology community was putting forward this vision of biotechnology for everyone. In 2008, 2009, a group of us got together and decided we were going to invite people off the internet into my house to try our first genetic engineering experiment.
Wow.
And then I'd like to say there's two different experiments that happened there. One was, can you actually use a kitchen to do sophisticated biotechnology? Answer, yes. But also, who's going to show up to a thing like that? And that also turned out to be a big surprise. That was everyone. And that was the origin story for Genspace. It went from there.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. When you say a group of us got together, were they just your friends? Were they your colleagues? How did you first get them excited or tell them, or how did you rally the folks?
The founders of Genspace were people who just met each other on the message board. We didn't know each other from Adam. Ellen Jorgensen put out a message on the DIYbio.org message board saying, hey, who wants to meet up? And we agreed that we would meet in some burger joint in Midtown in Manhattan. I showed up. Nurit Barshai showed up, who's an artist. Ellen's a molecular biologist. I'm a journalist. And then Russ Durrett and Sunwong Lim, both undergraduates at NYU. So it was a hodgepodge group. And later we met Oliver Medvedik, another molecular biologist. But that first meeting was an artist, a journalist, a scientist, and two aspiring scientists. And in some ways, I think that tells the story of Genspace, that there's a group of people who are creative in their own different ways, who are going to come together and explore that technology in their own way.
Yeah, we had interviewed Beth Tuck early on in the podcast, and we'll have to get Casey on at some point. We can dig deep into what Genspace is doing now and how it's evolving. You were there for some time as executive director, but then there was the Biodesign challenge that came into your world. How did that happen? I mean, now that's a force. You're creating these forces for really bringing biology to the world to make it more accessible. What's the origin story of the Biodesign challenge?
Well, so it was 7 years of Genspace, building it from scratch, learning how to run nonprofits, as well as learning the science, as well as learning what we were about. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I really struggled with as a journalist when I was writing about biotechnology, often the people who were starting the companies, coming up with the innovations, were PhD students in biology programs. They didn't necessarily have the real world experience to come up with new applications for biotechnology because they had spent their entire careers within the lab. And in the early days, I mean, it continues now, at Genspace, all these artists and designers and people from other backgrounds were showing up, and they had completely different ideas for how we would use that technology, how we would use biology. It dawned on me as a journalist in the daytime and as a Genspace founder at night that in order to see a functional, useful application of biotechnology, it was going to be all those voices talking to each other. And the other piece of that was that if we wanted to understand or really make a decision as a society about how we are going to use these technologies, it had to be a diverse group of people who are sitting at the table. It had to be the scientists sitting with the rest of the population. And I was seeing that at Genspace. So on one hand, I wanted to get these people working together, artists, designers, scientists working together. On the other hand, I want to have a deeper conversation about what we as a society want from our technologies. It just became clear that the best way to do that would be with undergraduates and basically work with design biology students, have design and biology professors work as their educators, then see what the ideas that they would put forth into the world. There was sort of a trapdoor in that whole project, which was the scientists and design professors, they're designers and scientists, they're both professionals, but they're also educators. So I thought by basically bringing them together as educators of those students, they would find commonalities and find partnerships. And that actually worked. So not only are we getting student projects that turn into companies, turn into social critiques, turn into art projects, we're also getting all these collaborations from the professors. And that's been really transformative as well.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I have very fond memories of the early Genspace days on Flatbush Avenue. And of course, Erum and I talk about meeting there at like an event at least 10 years ago. And then just seeing the organization come to life and take a life of its own. And same thing with Biodesign Challenge. I mean, you were there for 7 years. It's taken on a life of its own. You've got design schools from all over the world participating in the challenge. I remember when we wrote What's Your Biostrategy, Suzanne Lee had said the hardest position in the world to fill was the designer biotechnologist or the biotechnologist who understands design. And I'd like to think that that effort has really helped with that. What do you think? Do you think that's made a difference?
It depends on the day.
Yeah.
As a former journalist, you're always a skeptic. You're a skeptic about everything and you always question everything. So on good days, I'm like, wow, this has really made a major impact. And I see it in the universities and colleges that they're adding on biodesign classes and biodesign minors and majors. So, we're starting to see the beginning of departments that focus on this or labs and design departments.
Yeah.
And so that really makes me feel good. We're doing the work. It's happening out in the world. As a journalist, you want to see the actual stuff. You want to see the application take off and be used widely. For example, I've been writing about biomaterials for 15 years or so, and I only see it now starting to become a real thing in the world. That's a long time to wait.
10 years and $100 million. It's what it takes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would think you could also point to some successes that have come from Genspace and Biodesign Challenge. You really helped a lot of perhaps founders or people that are now in industry rethink their work. If it wasn't for Genspace or Biodesign Challenge, they might just be spinning in the wheel. They got out of just business as usual and were able to come to their work and to their ideas and to their companies from a biology perspective. Any success stories that you would like to share that's on top of your mind?
I have to mention, so I went eventually to work for one of our students. So I right now work at Tomtex as their chief strategist. And Tomtex is a materials company that's doing really amazing stuff in the leather space. But let's start at the beginning. At Genspace, Genspace had its first unicorn with Opentrons. That was a miracle. I mean, that's a story of a scientist, an engineer sitting down together with a design student and coming up with a new technology that has not only raised a lot of money, but was really instrumental in COVID testing over the last 5 years. So that's been amazing, 4 years. So that's one. The other one I think about is the winners of the first year's Biodesign Challenge were a group of students from Fashion Institute of Technology here in New York. I think there was a men's knitwear specialist. Their expertise had nothing to do with biotechnology, but they joined the Biodesign Challenge. They wanted to see how do we get ourselves out of this toxic, polluting fashion industry and make fashion that is actually better for the environment. They came up with a company called Keel Labs. Keel Labs makes yarn material from kelp, from seaweed. Their first prototype, when they presented it on stage in 2016, it looked like a piece of ramen. It did not look like a proper material at all. It looked like spaghetti. And it, just literally a week ago, they just put out a product with Stella McCartney. You can buy your tanks and t-shirts and sweaters with Keel Labs material. That's amazing.
That is amazing. That took less than 10 years.
Yeah. So I think we're accelerating the wheel in terms of getting these new materials out there, but it took a long time to get that rolling. But Keel Labs is a great one. Tomtex is a great one. Most recently, Electric Skin. This is a group of students that came through the Biodesign Challenge Sprint. 5 different women from 4 different continents We put them together as what we call the Franken team. They didn't know each other when we introduced them to each other. And we said, you guys seem all great. Why don't you innovate together? And just recently, Nada, one of them, was on the show Stars of Science. And she's one of the finalists to turn their idea into a reality. And that's amazing.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
That is amazing, especially if you consider that they did it over the course of less than a year.
I think that program was a month. They came up with the concept in a month.
That's
And now
amazing.
they've been working on it since 2022.
Amazing. With some of our guests, we talk a lot about biotech and the culture. If we were to go just to mainstream media, it still is relatively negative in people perceiving it. But we all know we're doing great things with it. But how do you see biotech shaping cultural perceptions? And how does creativity play into bridging science and everyday life?
That's a really good question. I think it goes both ways. I think popular culture informs how we apply our technologies and then vice versa. Maybe I'm wrong, but at least I don't hear about it as much. The GMO debate has sort of died down. On occasion, we'll see scary reports about do-it-yourself biologists / biohackers doing creepy stuff, but I don't see it nearly as much anymore. I think that technologies insinuate themselves in subtle ways. And so they become part of our culture before we even realize it. I think we all experienced the fundamental shift that happened with cell phones and computers and silicon technology. And life has never been the same after. It's continually changing. And I think about a before time and an after time. I remember when I was logging into AOL and you got to hear the modem sounds.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think about how everything changed after that. And I think biotech is going to do the same. And I argue even more so. We're not just changing silicon. We're not just changing the way we receive and broadcast information. We're changing living substance. And that's us. That's the living things around us. I don't know how it's going to go. I spend a lot of time reading science fiction to get ideas and projections on what might happen. But I think that the types of things that we're doing, I think the types of programming that Genspace, Biodesign Challenge you guys are doing is really, really important for us to think about what it is we want from this technology. Because ultimately, we, the users, we, the inventors, innovators, are the ones who decide. I think a program like Biodesign Challenge, where you get to see possible applications before they're actually created, I think that's a great way to have those conversations. What does it look like? How does it feel? How will it change the way we live? The first thing I look at in the morning is my cell phone, for better or worse. When biotechnology becomes ubiquitous in the way that we imagine, it might be that we're looking at something else.
Yeah. And since we're on the topic, this is centered around communicating biotech to the public. And that has been a challenge in the past, as Karl mentioned. And, we've been talking about this, but we're changing the game. We have this podcast and making it exciting. You've done all of your efforts and you've done very specific projects. So you talked about getting ideas inspired from not only Biodesign Challenge, but from science fiction, from other efforts, from videos. You were behind one of the most amazing biology experiences that I have experienced. And this was during SynBio Beta this year. You titled it The Parables of the Biotech Age. And it was a series of different performances and video. And it was so deep and profound. I couldn't even sleep that night. I had to process so much after seeing that. But first of all, what inspired you to do that? Were you just seeing all of this and you're like, okay, let's put this together and share it with this community? And then how do you think that this helps demystify science? How do you make this relevant to people in their daily lives?
Yeah. Parables for the Biotech Age happened by happenstance. We were invited to Synbio Beta in San Jose, California. John Cumbers asked me to chair the biodesign track. They'd never done a biodesign track. I happen to know people who run the biology program at the Tech Museum, which is literally across the street from the convention center. So I called them up and I said, let's do something together. We had no script. We had no idea. They basically said, hey, do you want to use our IMAX? It's the largest IMAX west of the Mississippi. And it's basically this enormous 4-story dome screen. Here, it's yours. Do something with it. And in some ways, it's the product of a month and a half of intense freaking out. In some ways, it's the product of 15 years of work in this space. When you look at the videos, when you look at the performances, these are the videos and performances that we've been collecting from the very beginning. And these are artists, these are scientists thinking about one question, which is, how does biotechnology feel? How will it feel to us when it's ubiquitous? How will it change the way that we relate with each other? How will it change the way that we think about the living things around us? How will it change the way we think about ourselves? It's already changed so much in such fundamental ways. A normal conversation is to bring up your 23andMe profile, RIP, but
Yeah, maybe not these days.
but I mean, it still comes up.
Yeah, it does.
Branchhistory.com or whatever it is. Like, oh, I'm going to go to get a spit test and discover something about my personal history. Well, what does that change about your sense of identity? I don't know the answer. I've been one of the people who are like, I don't want to do it. I don't know how they're using that data. I have enough points of evidence to understand a personal history. But other people, like, it really identifies to themselves who they are. So going back to parables, I wanted to create an experience for the audience where they could literally feel in their chest what it would be like to live in the biotech age. We mixed together all of these performances and hoped that it wasn't too weird or too out there for audience to just literally inhabit it for that 90 minutes. We're actually doing it again, by the way, on November 9th here in New York City.
Oh, nice. You heard that,
so-
folks. If you hear this before then, you got to get your ticket because it's going to sell
Buy
out.
your tickets.
Where at in New York, Dan?
So we're doing it in partnership with an organization called Media Art Exploration. So check out their website, mediaartexploration.com. The name of the festival is Max Live. They support artists who are doing artistic performances related to the sciences.
Oh, nice.
And so we're doing it in conjunction with them. But I see it as beyond the individual performances. I see this as a way to really explore the emotional aspect of technology, something that when you think about pointy-headed scientists, the emotional aspect is not something that you consider. And yet I think so much of this is emotional.
Oh, yeah. I
So-
definitely felt all the emotions during the parables. I laughed,
And
I
I throw a
cried.
question back at you. As the 100th podcast, you've been encountering the people who are actually doing the innovation. And they have their very personal reasons for why they've devoted their lives to whatever that innovation might be. What did you learn? Can you tell the audience about their motivations and who they are and why they do the things they do? What are some of the lessons you've learned along these 100 episodes?
So all sorts of different people. And there's two camps. There's those that went to school for biology or some deep science field, and they have stayed course and decided to commercialize their innovation. But then there are people that come from different disciplines into biology. And I think those are very interesting people as well. They all are interesting people, but to be able to see the forest through the trees being the complexity of biology, but saying, hey, look, I can see that vision. Those people, you can tell who they are. For example, we just had a gentleman named Yuji Suzuki from BitBiome, a gentleman who comes from the world of international relations and economics and just saw the economic value of biology from history and also from how innovation is taking it, and has done an amazing job with his team to create a platform for single cell sequencing as well as bioinformatics. And he is a fan of the pod. I know he's listened to all the episodes. He's probably listening now. And when he was on the podcast and even offline, it's like the conversations very similar to the conversations that we have, Dan. Like, what is the design? What does the future look like? What can you do with these things? So I think that's very exciting. But then there's a camp of people that are just copying, pasting things, like venture capital from software into venture capital into biotech. And they're just trying to gun it and force it, trying to get that MVP out there or create a platform, just like Amazon has a platform. And that tends to be interesting to see how their attitudes are different. Some are successful or becoming successful. Some have faltered and have learned and they're moving on. The people that come that are really entrepreneurial, they, I feel like, are having maybe a harder time when it comes to thinking of biology on a larger scale. They're having a hard time reconciling the economics of venture capitalism and how biology can permeate products and then thus the shelves and society. So I think it's been very interesting to see.
Karl, do you want to throw something in there? Or?
Yeah, Erum, I totally agree with you. I think I would describe it a little bit differently. And I'm going to pull from my punk rock roots because I feel like there's a punk rock element to this that most of these entrepreneurs don't even realize. It was very common for people to start bands. Hey, the three of us are going to start a band. We're going to do this thing and we're going to make our impact on the world. There's two camps when it comes to SynBio or just biotech in general. There is the camp where they're like, okay, we've got this disease or this problem that we want to go after, and we've got this technology that we'll leverage to use that. So you, Dan, talked about the genesis of Genspace with this different group of people coming together. And I think on the therapeutic side, when we talk to founders that are in that space, they tend to be very academically focused. They've got a problem that they're going after, a disease state. Whereas I think the other people, and I think this is where the punk rock comes in, are like, you know what, I don't really like the way the system works. And here's this technology that enables us to basically reprogram life at the atomic level. Here's this nanotech that actually works. How do we take that and turn it into good that's going to make the world a better place? We see both of those, and I think there is benefits to both sides of those approaches. And I think that on one level, everyone's playing this game. And there's different ways to play the game. Yeah, we're going to raise capital and we're going to do X, Y, Z. That's a great game to play and to figure out how to play it and win in it. But then there's the other game where it's like, hey, we're going to bootstrap this thing and we're going to transform the way this industry works. And that's another way to play the game. So that's my long-winded answer in terms of how I see the founders that we talk to and how I find them to be super impressive. And I find them to also be willing to look at their weaknesses and strengths and leverage those in ways that other people have not.
Yeah, I think personally, I've been spending 15 years trying to find the North Star or the North Stars for biotechnology. When I think about it, there's this gut-wrenching question at the center of it, which is, one, does a technology cause a social revolution, or does a social state basically shape the technology? And where is there wiggle room? Where can you move things? I think I sit a little bit in the punk rock camp because I'm like, oh, the technology can change the way that we literally spend our days and nights and change the things that we eat, change our economic system, et cetera, et cetera. And then I try to imagine what that other state would look like or what society might look like. And that's where my little fantasy starts to crash because I can't quite see it. Or the visions that I have seen for it don't seem realistic. So much of what we're trying to do in the world of industry is try to take biology and turn it into something you literally can pass down an assembly line and stamp into the same thing over and over again. And that's just not the way biology works. And yet design is based on an industrial process. Industrial design is about making that thing over and over again, making those surfaces shine like plastic. And that's not biology. So what are we working towards? Or is there a way that we can work towards something that's other than this? And I know I'm moving into the realm of science fiction, but ultimately, I think we're all looking for some sort of social transformation. I just don't know what that is. I don't think it's just like, I want to make big bucks with biology, because then you'd go find another profession.
Mm-hmm.
Technology can have an impact on society, and society can have an impact on technology. And the question is a chicken and egg question, which is going to have the bigger impact here. Because if we just basically apply biotechnology to the previous modes of production, number one, it probably won't work.
Yeah.
Or not well. And you're missing a lot of what biology offers. I mean that in a broader sense. I don't mean just like offers in a material sense. I mean offers in a spiritual sense, even.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Emotional, the way that we connect with other things. And I don't want us to miss that. So how do we introduce these technologies in a way that is transformative in a positive way?
Yeah.
One of the visions for Genspace was that it provided the community labs a window for people to see the living world around them in ways that they could never see otherwise. Here's a suite of tools in their neighborhood to understand the living world around them in such complicated, interesting ways. And not only to examine the glory and the breadth of what a living thing can do, but also explore what our connection to those living things are and see how similar we are in a lot of ways, and understand that we're made of the same stuff, which is so profound.
Yeah.
I mean, when I go back to my beginning of my career at Genspace, what was the most profound experience? The most profound experience was still looking at a droplet of pond water under the microscope and just seeing that every ounce of this planet is teeming with life. Just this beautiful, complicated zoo of organisms that we don't see on our level of exploration like that. When you start to think about that, when you go through your day, seeing the world through that scale, it's so profound. It's so much more profound than sitting down to write that next email you have to send.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I want to live in that.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole idea of taking past or existing industrial processes that have been designed to maybe extract plants and wood or create steel and make non-living products, but then to use it to make living products, there is a big disconnect. And from the biodesign challenge point of view, what are those first principles of biology? And then how do you rethink industrial processes based on how the biology is evolving and moving and growing? There are companies that are looking at that. When we're talking about the people that we've spoken with, there's one technology I'm really excited about is this concept of continuous batch fermentation. Instead of just making something and then stopping it and then processing it, what does it look like for it to continue to be made? And then that also jives well with an industrial process of scaling up. So like, I think that company based in Australia is called Cauldron Fern. It's a really interesting idea. And again, coming from a different part of the world, that's why I do love the fact that we have been speaking with people from all parts of the globe because they all have different perspectives. But I think we need to rethink how we operate as an industrial society, because that hasn't been working in some regard. Let me just say that. I don't want to be like climate change. It's not just about climate change and sustainability, but it's also just about what are good functioning products. It's 2024. Why are we still using the methodologies made in the 1900s? Let's level up.
Dan, what you're saying resonates really deeply, because the beauty of biology is like, okay, yeah, we can do all this transformation of industrial processes, which is great. Many industrial processes should be changed, and our relationship to the world should change from being this extractive species to something that lives more in harmony with our planet, which I think is going to be a leap for many of us. But then the other side of it is, how do you leverage biology to create these very custom, bespoke products that maybe only exist in Namibia and the rest of the world doesn't get it, but that's okay. We don't have to have mass-produced products for everything. And maybe that's one of the things that we can learn from biology biotech, is that maybe my Adidas shoes are produced locally. They're very different from the ones that I would buy if I was in Vietnam. They don't have to be the same.
Yeah, I don't think the VC model is the only way to go.
Yeah.
You don't have to start in seed round, get your investors, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of ways to do this. And I think we should be exploring them. One of my former students reached out and asked for advice. And I don't know if this was good advice, but he basically was saying he wanted to create something new in the world. And I said, well, you don't need to create a startup to transform the world. There are other ways to do this. If you really want to see change, you can also start a movement. You can start a community biology lab. You can start up the next, whatever that is. There's more you can do here than raise capital for a company. I would like to think of all of this as part of a larger ecosystem. But again, the challenge here is, what is the North Star? What are we all aiming towards? And if we can envision that, then how do we get there? How do we align ourselves so that we get to that next step? I think right now we should be thinking about species survival. We should be thinking about climate change. But how do we level up, as Erum said? I'm like struggling. I just feel myself emotionally, mentally trying to see what that path forward is. And I realize so much of the work that has happened over the last 15 years is about that struggle, is about that search for what is next. What is the world we want to live in? I think we're very lucky. We have it pretty good here. I'm in a nice hotel room in Seattle. I just had my little vacation, but that's not true for everyone, and that won't be true for everyone going into the future. So how do we move forward together, not individually?
I mean, I would say the past 15 years for you have been a consistent leveling up on such a massive scale with Genspace, with Biodesign Challenge, with TomTex, with Parables, with some new projects you have coming up. If you would like to share that, we would love to learn about that. And also, I know that you're reconciling what has happened in the past and how do we bring it into the future. But if you do have a crystal ball looking at what has happened and some of what you're looking at now, what are you most hopeful about in biotech? What do you see that could transpire in the next decade to help us think about that and maybe apply it to what we're doing today? We, meaning Karl, myself, the audience, you as well. You have to be thinking of a plan because you have been executing on some great projects. So tell us.
I can speak to it in the materials space. I think fashion materials have been the tip of the spearhead for introducing these technologies to the public. And as a journalist, I was writing about it very excitedly. And then it took forever to see the first products. And then the first products were like $10,000 for a hat or a tie or whatever it was. And it just seemed like totally not what my fantasy was. But I think that we're at this really interesting, critical moment where we could start to introduce these technologies to the public as a real alternative, as a different way of business as usual when we talk about clothes. I'm really excited about getting into that dialogue and engaging the general public about what this literally a fashion revolution, materials revolution means for everything else. So yeah, I'm now working at a company that's literally making materials for the fashion industry, largely because I think that dialogue is so important. Like if this works, then there will be the next industry that will transform, and then the next and the next and the next. And we'll get to see that domino effect, hopefully in our lifetimes. And hopefully that domino effect will be the thing that averts the climate crisis that literally we're living through right now.
Yeah.
I don't want to go dark, but I'm scared of the alternative. And very much when you look at Asheville and other places, you see what the alternative is, and it's terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, let's end with hope for the future.
Sorry.
On a dark note, Dan.
Let's say that for your dystopian novel. This is the Grow Everything podcast. We're really optimistic on this podcast. So
I'm optimistic. I am optimistic. I think more and more people realize the alternative is not palatable. So we have no choice but to go down this path. So yeah, let's start with fashion materials. It's low stakes, but has a huge impact in terms of climate. And we'll go from there. What that future looks like, kind of want to just promote November 9th. Come to our event and you'll get to feel it out. It's not just one thing. It's a lot of things.
Yeah.
And let's embrace that complexity because that's our present and that will absolutely be our future.
Yeah, I think that's great. I love that. I think we should end with that.
Dan Grushkin, thank you so much for coming on the Grow Everything podcast. It's a joy. We'll have you back on. You're such a friendly. 100 episodes. I know you held out, but don't hold out on us again because I know that there's so much coming up for you. We need you back on. We need your thinking. You bring us down to earth. You make us think a lot on a greater, more creative scale. And so we always love speaking with you.
I love being here and I love working with you guys. I love seeing you guys perform the podcast live. Please do that again. And another 100 episodes. I can't wait. And I'll certainly be here before 200, I promise.
Okay,
Yay.
let's make sure that happens. Awesome.
Erum, how did you like that conversation with Dan?
We could talk forever with Dan, which we continue to talk to him afterwards, which then I was like, should we continue recording this? And even before we recorded, we were having such a profound conversation. I'm like, stop talking and let's record this because that's Dan. We talk about very deep philosophical understandings or questions around biology and what that means when you can work with it and change it and shape it like we're doing today. So I always love speaking with Dan. How did you feel about the episode?
And I super enjoy having conversations with Dan. I especially like the conversation we had around parables for the biotech age. I know that we talked about it back in May after we came back from Symbio Beta, because that was the debut of that. That was just such a wonderful, immersive event. I want to see that on the road so that everybody can see it and experience the parables for the biotech age. I mean, we started talking a little bit about the controversy around IVF and choosing intelligence at the top of this episode. And parables for the biotech age is the kind of event that sparks those kinds of discussions.
Yeah. Also, as the listener and everyone can tell when Dan speaks, he proceeds with caution. And I think that's super valuable in a startup ecosystem where we're like very optimistic about the future and we're just gunning for having some type of impact without necessarily thinking of every single risk point. And I appreciated that not only in this conversation, but also in parables where that type of narrative comes out, where it's if we can do this, should we do this? Should we design people in very specific ways? But then there's always the concept that anything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Right.
That's true. And then how do you prevent that wrongness from occurring? I think Dan should have been at the biosecurity event. He really should have. I think he would have a great contribution to help us think of scenarios that we need to prepare for. Speaking with Dan, let's have him back on because he is always moving and shaking. We don't know, probably by next year, he'll co-found 2 other organizations. He is a force, as you can tell. There's a whole world that he's brought into life. We are lucky to be a part of it. So we'll continue to report to you on what's going on at Genspace, at the Biodesign Challenge. TomTech's, of course, an amazing company. They're very lucky to have Dan as a part of their team. And here we go. We're entering a new era, the era of post-100 episode grow everything. So there's going to be a lot more surprises, interesting guests. We're going to try to do some more live recordings. So having some events to bring people together because our production team at Amplify, hello, Hector, Paige, Kevin, you guys are amazing. And one of the things they say is that it's not just a podcast. It's more than that. It's about building a movement. It's about building a brand. It's about getting people together. It's not what Karl and I talk about, but it's about what you guys talk about to other people when you hear our conversations. And hopefully when you guys talk to us, because we definitely welcome that. And we appreciate everyone that has reached out to us about different ideas or suggesting guests or sharing your thoughts. It's always great to have a conversation when it comes to grow everything. Please continue to reach out to us. Our information's in the show notes. We would love for you to be a part of our community. Let's continue the conversation for our planet and for ourselves. I'll talk to you later. Bye.